Okay, one more topic I wanted to cover with regard to VAMP is a feature called Trace. This is a slightly different kind of purpose. What Trace does is it takes an object that sort of traces along the surface of that in sort of a structured squiggle. And you've probably seen this in some of my songs, perhaps. Makes for a really neat effect when done with vector art, but it also actually sounds pretty good because the trace is a single. It's sort of a single string. It doesn't have these sort of discontinuous breaks that are so common, and so what you end up with is a lot more kind of smoother sounds. I find it to be a pretty neat sound, very useful musically, but it's also pretty fun to look at. So let me kind of walk through how Trace works and how to use it in OsciStudio. So I've created this object, and this is basically it's just a cube that's been subdivided a couple of times, and I removed some of the faces from the cube, so it's sort of got these cavities. I've also got a couple of. This is what the object looks like. I've also put a solidify and a subdivision modifier on it, just to kind of give it a little more surface detail. One thing about Trace is it needs a little bit of detail to work with. What Trace does is I'm going to apply these. It will start with an arbitrary vertex, and it will trace to the nearest nearby vertex, and it will trace again to the nearest one, and it works its way around the object. Every time it goes through each point only once, right? And what it does is sort of traces this interesting squiggle around. And there's a couple of different modes, and I'll show you how those work in just a minute. But the setup is very similar to the rest of VAMP. If you haven't watched my other videos, you should watch those. But one of the requirements is that you have a camera. I've got one. This is the camera. And then the other requirement is you have at least one object in a collection, which again, VAMP input is the name of the collection. Interestingly, the camera really isn't used with trace mode, but it is one of the sort of core requirements of VAMP to work, and Trace uses a lot of VAMP's sort of infrastructure, if you will. So one of the tests that it's testing for is the presence of the camera. But let's go into the VAMP menu. All the trace settings are down at the bottom. We've been working up here for all of these sort of normal VAMP and edge removal activities, but here's where Trace works. So go ahead and click Trace once. Okay. Notice it took a little while. It's doing a lot of work. Go ahead and hide this, and I'll show you what the resulting trace looks like. This object, you can see it sort of drew around each one of these spines. Roll it around here, you can see what's going on. And yeah, this object is pretty good for trace if you have an object that's just got surfaces. Let's go ahead and try it with a different object. Excuse me. Into here, you can see how it created these curves, sort of worked its way around those vertices that were located along these sort of spines. Trace has a couple different modes. This particular one I ran based on the verts. You can also run it based on the faces. So we'll do it based on the, once again, we'll do it based on the faces in the original object. You see that's got a slightly different look to it. It's pretty similar because the structure is the same. Also do it on the edges. Worth experimenting with this once you kind of get an object and shape you like. This is working. There we go. Yeah, I like that one the best, I think. This one is going off the lines, the edges that were part of that object. Back to the original object. Just kind of drawing right along those edges. Get away. Okay. So once you get an object you like, drop it into OsciStudio, same as we've done before. Now, one thing to note, this object has a lot of verts on it. How many is really? The object has 4,000. Trace has 10,000. Well, it's possible that will choke OsciStudio. It's possible it won't. Let's give it a try. Start it up here. We'll get the stuff from last time. Okay. OsciStudio 2,000. Oh, let's crank that up. Let's call it 200,000. See if we can do it without pushing it. All right. So the object came through just great. It's time to disconnect. And then we will just work in OsciStudio. So this object is pretty complicated. There's a lot going on, but put this on a slight rotation and you use this trace feature that's built into OsciStudio. This is just cake. Anywho, this is the trace feature. Let me walk you through some of the sort of functions that remain. We'll go ahead and turn this off. Hide it away. Okay, back to Blender. The limit here, this is a limit on the number of verts in the original object. And this one really should pay attention to this as a speed limit because 10,000 is already a lot. I've got a pretty powerful computer. If you go much higher than that, it increases. It's not linear. It's like logarithmic or something. It gets slower, faster, the faster you go, the further you go. So use with caution, save often, the usual. Turn on trace. This is for use with turn on VAMP. If you have turn on VAMP turned on and you have an animation, and you can also turn on trace, and then each step of the animation, it will run the trace process as well. And after it's done with the trace, you can output the trace as an animation to OsciStudio. One thing to keep in mind is that the trace doesn't always start in the exact same location in terms of the vert. So if you have, especially if you have an original object that is deforming, is morphing, you may find that the trace sort of jumps around where it's starting, which lines trace to which. The trace algorithm says what's the nearest vert that I haven't already been to, and goes to that one. And so you could tell that if your object is changing shape, that path is going to be different for different frames of the animation. So it looks pretty cool, but just keep that in mind if you need more consistency. You can also take this trace object and deform it. You can shrink it, X or Y axis. You can do all sorts of deformations. So there's some pretty fun options once you have this thing built up. We talked about before what the sources for the data are. Faces, edges, and verts. This is sort of the original data. You can also use the output of a regular VAMP, and send that into trace. And that's what these two are, flat sliced, flat silhouette. And that's basically once it creates this. Okay, so this is the flat sliced. You can use that as an input or a trace, and it will try to trace through this. Let's give that a try. Slice. Should go here. All right, now it's done. Okay, so this is the result of the trace, which was based on this sliced. This is kind of useful if you like how the silhouettes are moving, but you want to take advantage of some of the trace functionality. You can do that. This is really the only place in VAMP where it does two separate processes sequentially, so it's definitely slow. Please note that the trace feature really doesn't work with the grease pencil line art feature, because trace is looking for a lot of verts, and grease pencil line art is just the data stored differently, so it doesn't work. Last option to talk about here is what type of output curve is it? Bezier, I think it's pronounced, or NURBS. I tend to use Bezier because it works. I think NURBS is another option that you can use. I haven't moved to that because I haven't found it as reliable, but please experiment with it and tell me how it goes. Anyways, this is the VAMP Trace feature. I think it's pretty neat. I've used it for a number of songs. It actually sounds not so bad. Let's get a little here. So if you want something like this in one of your projects, play with Trace. Tell me how it goes. Love to hear what people are doing with it, and if you get stuck, let me know. I want to help. Have a great afternoon and a great day, and thanks for watching.